Just 20 or even 10 years ago, Chinese cities were often synonymous with impenetrable smog, air so thick it was impossible to be outside, and cities that regularly topped rankings of the world's most polluted places. As industrialization and the economy surged, China's energy sector was forced to grow just as rapidly, and it did so in a decidedly dirty way, primarily by burning coal. Today, China is becoming a symbol of the energy transition, and its ambition to build the world's largest renewable energy system is already becoming reality. In this piece, we'll explore how China is managing that energy transition, what the pitfalls are, and how China remains, to this day, the world's largest consumer of coal. Let's dig in. How did China become the world's biggest energy consumer in the first place? Energy growth is closely tied to economic growth and industrialization. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Communist Party attempted to replicate Stalin's methods of collectivization and industrialization. But these proved ineffective, and China remained an agrarian country for decades. Mao Zedong's rule also brought enormous suffering, mass famine, and political repression. The turning point came after Mao's death, with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, the man widely regarded today as the father of China's modern economy. In 1978, he launched the policy of reform and opening up, a gradual shift away from rigid central planning toward a more flexible market economy, all while maintaining the formal commitment to communism as official doctrine, a commitment China still maintains today. Farmers were allocated land by the state, and special economic zones, SEZs, were established to attract foreign investment, including from the United States. These zones offered favorable conditions for investors: lower taxes, generous incentives, and access to a vast and cheap workforce. Over time, the zones expanded and investment flowed in. Western technology and management practices were absorbed, and China began opening to the world. By the late 1990s, China was earning the title of the world's factory. The largest corporations from across the globe poured in, manufacturing literally everything, from garments to home appliances. China became the world's largest exporter and eventually a major exporter of technology as well, which is plainly visible today. As all of this unfolded, China's energy consumption grew at a staggering pace. Thousands of factories required electricity, and where would it come from? Coal became the backbone of China's energy system. It was cheap, abundant, and domestically available. Coal power was the most straightforward way to meet China's exploding energy needs. Many European countries had relied on it during their own industrialization, so there was nothing novel about the approach. But over decades of breakneck growth, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Electricity consumption multiplied dozens or even hundreds of times over, and coal use grew alongside it. This pushed China to the top of global CO2 emissions rankings, while Chinese cities choked under regular smog. Residents wore masks, and rates of respiratory illness climbed. International pressure intensified. Environmental issues moved to the forefront of global politics, and international organizations began setting emissions reduction targets. China, as the world's leading consumer of dirty energy, found itself unable to ignore the mounting pressure. Talk of reducing coal dependence and moving toward alternative energy actually began surprisingly early, in the early 2000s. At that stage, the motivation wasn't primarily ecological. China wasn't particularly concerned with that yet, and global political dynamics were different, but rather about diversifying risk. China's energy system was dangerously dependent on a single fuel source, and that vulnerability was already causing problems. Rolling blackouts hit the country in 2003 and 2004. In response, China passed its renewable energy law in 2005, which began incentivizing companies to scale up solar, wind, and other clean energy capacity through subsidies and tax benefits. A dedicated renewable energy fund was established, which grew larger each year, and the law was updated multiple times. By 2010, China had become the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels, overtaking Germany and the United States. Today, that dominance is near total. In the 2000s, China confronted its environmental crisis head-on, Severe smog events struck Chinese cities in 2012 and 2013. In 2013, Heilongjiang province in the north, centered on the city of Harbin, was so heavily polluted that all flights were grounded for several days and schools were shut. The WHO reported that pollution levels in Harbin exceeded safe limits by 40 times, an extreme level that posed a serious threat to public health. This event became a major catalyst for Chinese authorities. It became clear that coal pollution could no longer be ignored, and it gave fresh momentum to the push for alternative energy. In 2014, new Chinese leader Xi Jinping unveiled his own green transition program, dubbed the Energy Revolution. Its pillars included improving energy efficiency and consumption patterns, continuing the gradual move away from coal, which still accounted for roughly 80% of China's energy at the time, developing domestic technologies to achieve long-term energy independence, and pursuing international cooperation. On that last point, international cooperation, China had previously resisted such commitments, arguing that it still needed economic growth. That changed at the APEC summit in Beijing, where Xi Jinping and U.S. President Barack Obama signed a landmark joint climate statement. China pledged to peak its CO2 emissions by 2030 and to have clean energy account for 20% of its total energy mix by then. These were not empty promises. In the years that followed, China dramatically accelerated its clean energy build-out, producing solar panels faster and more cheaply than anyone, and cementing its position as the world leader in both solar manufacturing and deployment. In 2020, Xi Jinping raised the stakes further, announcing that China aims to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, a commitment echoed by many Western nations. Notably, the climate agenda became, to a surprising degree, a rare area of common ground among major powers that otherwise clashed on virtually everything else. In November 2024, China passed its first comprehensive energy law, which came into force on January 1, 2025. It codified the legal framework for the country's sweeping energy system reform and reaffirmed China's commitment to the green transition. Oil and gas represent a separate and complex challenge for China. In earlier decades, China was actually an oil and gas exporter. In the 1970s, for instance, it exported oil to Japan. The Docking oil field, still China's largest, was once a source of national pride, celebrated by Mao as a symbol of socialist achievement. But economic growth and industrialization eventually transformed China into an oil and gas importer in the 1990s, making it dependent on the rest of the world. This dependence became a strategic concern. In 2003, President Hu Jintao articulated what became known as the Malacca Dilemma, China's vulnerability stemming from its reliance on the Strait of Malacca, through which up to 80% of its oil flowed. A blockade of that strait could cripple the Chinese economy. China views the United States and India as the primary threats in the region. Since then, China has worked to diversify its oil and gas supply routes, via Russia and Central Asia, among others, though it remains heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Gas, like in Europe, serves as a transitional fuel, bridging the gap between coal and renewables, though China's gas dependency is relatively modest. Meanwhile, the 2020s have heralded a new era in China's domestic oil consumption. The massive shift to electric vehicles is reducing demand for oil at home, while China has simultaneously built up record strategic oil reserves. In this way, China is hedging its bets, reducing risk, and working to break free from oil dependence. In 2024, for the first time, alternative energy sources surpassed oil in China's energy mix, a genuine milestone. All of this is part of the broader green transition strategy, driven not just by ecology, but by the goals of self-sufficiency, independence, and national security. It's worth noting that China is no slouch in hydrocarbon production either. It ranks fourth globally in natural gas production, behind the US, Russia, and Iran, and fifth in oil, behind the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Canada. Despite that substantial output, China's economy is so vast that it must import energy from all corners of the globe to sustain its growth. Now let's get concrete and look at what China is actually building. China's solar build-out is nothing short of extraordinary. As noted, China has long dominated solar panel manufacturing, making it self-sufficient on equipment. The country's total installed solar capacity reached 1,200 gigawatts by the end of 2025. To put that in perspective, first, China is years ahead of its own schedule. This target had been set for 2030. Second, China's growth rate outpaces every other country on Earth, and has for years. In 2023 alone, China installed more solar capacity than the United States has installed in its entire history. China's cumulative solar capacity now exceeds that of all other countries combined, and it continues to grow faster than anyone. The most famous project is in the Kabuki Desert, unofficially known as the Great Solar Wall. NASA has published satellite images of this Chinese megaproject, which is steadily filling the desert with solar panels. When complete in 2030, it will cover a strip 400 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, generating 100 gigawatts. For scale, France's entire power system produces roughly 130 to 140 gigawatts. This single project would account for about 75% of that. The largest currently operational megaproject is the Tahltan Solar Park in Tibet, with a current capacity of 21 gigawatts and still expanding. What's particularly interesting about it is that beyond clean energy, it's having unexpected positive environmental effects. Vegetation is growing better under and around the panels. The area is being used for livestock grazing, and soil erosion in the region has decreased. A surprising and welcome side effect. In short, if you open a list of the world's largest solar energy projects, China occupies the top positions by a very wide margin. There are bottlenecks, of course. Many projects are located far from the main centers of consumption. Projects are in the north, while economic activity is concentrated in the south. China is therefore scaling up energy storage capacity, which adds both cost and its own environmental footprint. Wind energy is another major pillar of China's strategy. And again, China leads the world. China's total installed wind capacity has exceeded 650 gigawatts, roughly half of its solar capacity, but still a colossal figure. For comparison, that's equivalent to Poland's entire power system. China excels in both onshore and offshore wind. Among the largest projects is the Gansu Wind Farm Complex in the Gobi Desert, with a capacity of 20 gigawatts. Offshore, China is pushing the frontier, pursuing large-scale projects far out to sea, where winds are stronger but engineering demands are far greater. The world's biggest wind projects are, again, in China, and the country continues to expand its share. The same geographic challenge applies. Many installations are distant from major demand centers. Hydropower is more established, but it already covers around 13% of China's total energy needs. The flagship project is the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, one of the world's great rivers. Construction began in 1992, and the dam entered service in 2003. With a total capacity of 22.5 gigawatts, it remains the world's largest power station. Other notable projects include the Baihatan Dam, commissioned in 2022, and the Xiluodu Dam. The most ambitious project on the horizon is the Medog Hydropower Station in Tibet, construction of which began last year, with a planned completion in 2033 and a projected capacity of 60 gigawatts, roughly 3 times larger than the Three Gorges Dam. The price tag, $137 billion. China is also aggressively building pumped storage hydropower plants, which function as giant rechargeable batteries. When there's a surplus of electricity, from solar panels on a sunny summer day or from wind turbines in a windy season, water is pumped up to a reservoir. When demand peaks in the evening, the water is released downhill through turbines to generate electricity on demand. What makes this story even more significant is not just China's domestic energy transformation, but the global dependencies it is creating. The trend toward green energy is now present, to varying degrees, in virtually every developed country, and even many developing nations see it as the path forward, with China as the model to emulate. As demand for green energy technology grows worldwide, China's global influence will only increase. China is pursuing all these projects with domestic technology, domestic expertise, and domestic manufacturing capacity, remaining essentially self-sufficient. This has made China the dominant player in virtually every segment of the green energy supply chain. China produces roughly 80% of the world's solar panels, up to 80% of all batteries, essential for energy storage and for electric vehicles, themselves a key part of reducing oil dependence, and controls around 60% of global wind turbine production, and that's before we get to rare earth metals, which remain critical across all these industries. Because the Chinese government heavily subsidizes all green transition manufacturing, Chinese products are sold at prices that undercut global competitors, and the scale of production China has built up will be very difficult for anyone to match anytime soon. The underlying technology increasingly belongs to Chinese companies as well. In a striking historical irony, it is China, not the Western nations that set the green agenda, that has ended up at the vanguard of the energy transition. And in doing so, the Chinese government has achieved remarkable results while making much of the rest of the world dependent on Chinese technology. This has created an awkward dilemma in the West. There's no widespread rejection of the green transition, yet tariffs on Chinese goods and technology are actively slowing down the very transition those same governments have pledged to achieve. And yet, here is the striking paradox. In recent years, China has also been setting records in the construction of new coal-fired power plants, the very things it supposedly intends to phase out. What's going on? In 2024, China broke ground on 94.5 gigawatts of new coal capacity and resumed construction on previously shelved projects, the highest figure in a decade. This is largely explained as insurance against future crisis. China experienced a painful energy crunch in 2021, with rolling blackouts nationwide, and its leaders are determined not to repeat it. The fundamental challenge of renewable energy is its dependence on factors humans cannot control: sun, wind, river levels. This makes forecasting harder and supply gaps more painful. So Chinese authorities have opted for a strategy of balanced development rather than an abrupt exit from fossil fuels, in contrast to some Western countries that have rushed to close thermal and even nuclear plants. China notably has no intention of abandoning nuclear power. Quite the opposite. It continues to build nuclear capacity aggressively and leads the world in that domain too. What's more, the new thermal plants are significantly more energy efficient than the old ones, and they're intended to serve as backup capacity for critical situations. In the past couple of years, they've been running well below full capacity because the need hasn't been there. China's trajectory in clean energy looks ambitious and genuinely impressive. It has already become the undisputed leader in solar, wind, and hydropower, displacing every other country, including the most advanced economies, and the growth rate remains record-setting. This translates into growing energy autonomy and independence from global oil and gas markets. Technologically, China is pulling ahead of the rest of the world in green energy, which means other countries increasingly depend on China if they want to develop their own clean energy sectors, a significant geopolitical trump card. At the same time, China's leaders are keeping their options open, maintaining traditional energy sources as a backstop. The direction of travel is clear, the pace is extraordinary, and the rest of the world is still catching up.